Welcome back, Chemistry. Today we are starting Chapter 2, Measurements and Calculations. So this first section I'm going to cover in one video, scientific method, and then when we get to the units of measurements, I'll probably break that up into a few different parts. So here we go with the scientific method. Our learning objectives today: describe the purpose of the scientific method. And I know we always go through the scientific method in every science class here, but we'll go through it one more time. Distinguish between qualitative and quantitative observations, and then finally be able to describe the differences between hypothesis, theories, and models. So the scientific method is a logical approach to solving problems, either by making an observation and then you gather data. You formulate a hypothesis, which is a statement that you can test using an experiment. Then you test it, and then from there you can formulate theories that are supported by the data. So if you take a look at the scientific method, I know maybe in elementary school it was kind of like a step-by-step. First you do this, then step number 2, then step number 3, but we're trying to get away from that. The scientific method is more like a flow chart, if you will. So this is the best diagram I could find usually for that flow chart, where you can go in pretty much any direction depending on where you start. Okay, so let's start with observation. Okay, so when we make observations, you can use your senses. You can see something, you can hear something, you can smell, taste, touch, and then you start to think like, oh, I wonder why that is, or what's going on here. You can make measurements, and measurements can be parts of your observation. And when you collect data, you're either collecting descriptive data, which we call qualitative data, or numerical, numbers. You're measuring the mass, you're measuring the length, the height, the volume, whatever that is, that's quantitative. So if it has numbers, we call it numerical. If it's descriptive, we call it qualitative. So over here with the Coca-Cola can, we have several qualitative as well as quantitative observations we can make. For qualitative, you can say that the Coca-Cola can is a metal, it's got some shiny parts, it's red and white, it's got words on it. For the quantitative, anything with numbers, 12, I just realized my face is covering that Coke can. 12 fluid ounces, 355 milliliters, 140 calories per can. So those would be all be examples for quantitative data. Now, when you study an object, the object that you are looking at, okay, in an experiment, we call that a system. Okay, so I would call this a system. And we'll come back to systems later on the semester, but just to give you that preview, system is the object that's being studied in an experiment. All right, hypotheses are testable statements. Okay, so when we do experiments, a lot of times scientists are looking for patterns or relationships, cause and effect, the trend, does it increase, decrease, and they try to use these patterns and relationships to predict what might happen in the future. So generalizations are used to form our hypotheses, and a lot of times our hypotheses are set up in an if-then statement, which is good. I mean, it's good, but if you really want to make your hypothesis stand out and be awesome, you would use an if-then statement plus a possible explanation as to why that occurred. Now you got a really good hypothesis. So let's take a look at a few examples. On the next slide, my bad. Let's talk about the definitions of hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a tentative statement, and it's made stronger through repetitive testing. You can always go back and revise your hypothesis after you gather some more input. But when you test your hypothesis, you want to make sure that you have controls, conditions that are the same in every single trial. You want to have normal conditions so you can compare your experimental back to your normal conditions. Some variables that you should be familiar with. Independent variable is the variable that you change. So if I'm looking at how light affects plants, light would be my independent variable. I might have a plant in a cabinet, a dark cabinet, a plant on the windowsill, a plant being exposed to 24 hours of light. Those are all independent variables. It's what I changed. Your dependent variable is how are you going to measure to see the effects of that variable. So I might measure plant height, or whether or not the seeds germinate, maybe the time of germination. Okay, so that would be an example of dependent variable. So what are you going to measure to see those effects? So going back to hypotheses, okay, You want to avoid I think or I predict statements and go to the if-then examples. So if I measure the bounce and height of a new basketball with 3 different pressures, then the ball with the higher pressure will bounce 10% higher. So notice that I can test this to see if my prediction, my hypotheses, holds true. And then, I can either refute my hypotheses or accept it. Here's another one. If the diffusion rate through a membrane is related to molecular size, then the smaller the molecule, the faster it will pass through a membrane. That one doesn't really have a statement that you can test, but maybe, you can look at time, okay? If the temperature of a cup of water is raised, then the amount of sugar that dissolves will increase. And you might go on to say because of increased molecular movement, okay? If the rate of photosynthesis is related to wavelengths of light, then exposing a plant to different colors of light will produce different amounts of oxygen. So again, another statement that you can test. You can capture the oxygen and see if different amounts are made. All right, moving on to scientific theories. So hypotheses, if-then statements, tentative, they can be revised and changed depending on your data. Now, theories are well established, okay? Highly reliable, backed by tons of evidence, lots of studies. Okay, I know in everyday English we tend to use the word theory as like some type of hypothetical situation, but in science, theory is pretty much fact until something comes along and throws that theory out the window. So like the cell theory, all living things are made of cells. Cells come from other cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. Well, until we come across a living thing that's not made up of cells, but it's alive and it exhibits all the other characteristics, well then that cell theory needs to be changed, okay? So a hypothesis is an explanation for why a certain outcome should be expected because you're using like observations and previous knowledge to form them. It's supported by evidence and cannot be proven true. It can only be disproven, really. Now, theories are broad generalizations that explain facts or phenomena, and we tend to use models to try to explain that phenomena, either visual models or verbal models or even mathematical models. Okay, so here's a diagram just showing the scientific method where you observe, you form those hypotheses, you test it using an experiment. If the data does not support the hypothesis, you revise it or reject it. If enough tests are done, they might help us form a theory, a broad generalization that explains a phenomena. And then from there, we can use that data to construct models to help us predict the outcome and then maybe even get published, okay? So tomorrow in class, we're going to do an Oreo lab. Very similar to your EL fudge lab, but I'm going to see if I can snag a package of mega Oreos, and we'll do a comparison of original Oreos to double stuffed to mega Oreos, and I'll just kind of revamp it a little bit. But it'll be kind of like you're going to solve the problem. I'm just going to kind of let you go at it, I think, for it. So, yeah, that's all I got. See you tomorrow.